All right. Like audio is fine, you guys have me? Okay, sounds good. Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, so yeah, the second volume of Enterprise Integration Patterns, that's a long-lasting story, so we'll talk about that a little bit later. What we'll talk about today is enterprise architecture, right? So and a lot of that is based on my experience when I did work as the chief architect at Allianz, right, for about 5 years. And when I took the job, and originally the job title was the head of enterprise architecture. To be honest, I didn't really know what enterprise architecture was, and I didn't really know why I'm the head of this thing, and I didn't also know what the other people are, whether they're the feet or arms or I don't know. So this whole thing seemed very mysterious to me. But then over time, I actually developed a quite deep appreciation for the need of enterprise architecture and also maybe a different viewpoint of what it means to me, which can be quite different than sort of what some of the other folks or tool vendors, kind of the point of view that they have about what enterprise architecture is and isn't. So what I like to do today is share a little bit about this because it's always a bit mysterious. What does a chief architect really do? What is this enterprise architecture thing? And I find that especially in a situation where we're talking about change, which if you think about it, almost every talk we had so far today is all about doing things differently, about reteaming, changing the way you develop software, having a different model, right? So all we talk about is about change. So when you're in an organization where change is going on, that's a good thing, you'll also find that the role of enterprise architecture becomes a very, very important one. Now the catch with enterprise architecture is that people have some common misconceptions. And sadly, the way it often is with misconceptions is that they are also sometimes based on reality. So here's the first misconception, and that is the enterprise architects live high up in the ivory tower. Just down a tiny bit here. So they live high up in the ivory tower, meaning, they make all these diagrams and these models, and they have all these fantastic thoughts, but they tend to be completely detached from reality. Right? And that makes the architects happy because they don't know it's detached from reality, so they live in a little dream world up in the ivory tower, right? And every once in a while, they convey their great ideas with standards and governance and IT strategies and whatever these things are labeled, right? And in the end, they get largely ignored by the people doing the actual work. And on occasion, that's even a good thing that they're being ignored because, sometimes what they cook up doesn't work that well in reality. So that's misconception number one, and unfortunately also, sometimes the reality. Misconception number two is that once you made it to be the chief architect, right? It's like chief architect, right? So it's like, like a really important architect, you get the idea that you're going to be like this guy. Well, if you think about a chief architect, now that's a chief architect, right? Like that's the person who knows everything, who makes all the decisions, right? It's like, you came to the top of the career ladder, to be like this guy. Has a few problems to it. Well, the one problem with it, as we all know, right, is this is not a human being, this is a computer program, right? Because it's the machines running the matrix, yada, yada, long story, right? But basically, yes, the architect isn't a human being. So trying to be the all-knowing, all-deciding, sort of omniscient kind of architect is a little bit tough, right? Especially when you work in a large enterprise. So that's not going to work very well because even as we'll find out, just getting transparency on what's actually happening is already quite difficult. Now, the other catch with this is that you will find an organization, well, you will find some people who believe they're like this person, and that has its own set of issues. But the other thing that you will find is some other folks in the organization are actually sometimes quite happy to have this character. So they're looking for you to be the all-deciding architect because that has one great advantage. They don't have to be responsible for their decisions. Right? Because they get you as the great chief architect to sort of decide, right? And if something doesn't work out exactly the way you expected, right? Well, then you go back to the chief architect and say, well, So in the end, the problem with this is, A, it doesn't work, but people sometimes actively like to push you in this corner because it sort of disassociates them from perhaps risky or difficult decisions that they rather not make. Huh? So now we've seen like what enterprise architecture isn't, right, or shouldn't be, right? So I probably owe you an answer what I think it is and what it should be, right? Before we do this, though, and this is always a good question, right? When you look at something and say, how should it work? How should I build something? How should I do something? You should first ask, what's the purpose, Right? Why are we doing this at all? Always a good question, right? Because we as software engineers, we're always in the solutions. We're always building something. We're always paid to build something, to fix something, to make something, to deploy something, right? And too often we sort of forget to sort of ask the short question, like, where's the purpose of this thing, right? And as we'll find out in an enterprise context, the question of purpose and the question of value is very closely interlinked. And both of those are very important concepts that are too often forgotten. So my definition or my view of the purpose of enterprise architecture is that it is really the glue between the business architecture and the IT architecture. You know, sometimes people ask, is the enterprise architect a business person, IT person? Well, this kind of answers this in a little bit of a philosophical way. It's just like whatever you need to make the glue. Right? If you find a person that does both, is great. If you find two people who can do it together, any of these are good. In the end, it is all about making the connection. Now, the interesting thing is, in our field, we will find a lot of people who are called IT architect. We don't find so many people that are called business architect, right? So who here is a IT architect, software architect, any kind of technology architect? It's not that many either, okay, like a handful. Well, the rest is shy because I just talked about what architects are in, right? So the rest is reconsidering their role after I burst the bubble with a matrix. But who here is business architect? Okay, yeah, is that a hand? Okay, there's a hand back there, fantastic, right? So we have one business architect. It's much rarer to find business architects. But that doesn't mean that there's no business architecture, right? Your business obviously has an architecture, right? What is architecture? Architecture is, like basically the big picture, how things fit together, the important decisions you make, right? Making sure everything sort of fits together. Obviously, somebody is doing that with the business divisions, the business units, the products go to market, right? Somebody does that. Now, the interesting thing is that that is generally done by people who have different titles. They're often the division heads or the business leaders, right? They're usually senior people in the business division who are really kind of the architects of that business. But they often don't have the title because the field is just not that established, or at least the term is not that established. But you will have business architecture, and the key role, the key purpose of being an enterprise architect is to make sure that these two things align. Now, that has one interesting consequence, and that is in many digital companies, the difference between IT and business is very, very small, right? When I was at Google for 7 years, nobody ever said, we need to talk to the business, or like vice versa. Nobody ever said we need to talk to the IT, right? It was inseparable, right? And then sometimes people make the argument, well, that's because Google is a technology company, but we are an insurance company, bank, telco, whatever. And to me, that distinction doesn't work very well because, well, Google is an advertising company, right? Like a vast majority of the revenue comes from advertising, right? On the Google Cloud side, you can say that's technology, right? But like 95% is advertising. Just advertising is a services business, just like being a bank or an insurance company, no difference. And vice versa, both companies would not last very long without technology. If you pull the technology plug on Google, that won't go very well, but if you pull the technology plug on any modern bank or insurance company, that will go equally poorly, right? You will not survive a few days even. So in the end, for me, that distinction doesn't really exist. They're just organized differently, right? They understood that the role of IT is not to run the HR system somewhere in the corner. Google has, and the other digitals have understood that the role of IT is to drive the business. That means something interesting. That means do like the Googles, Facebooks, the Amazons of the world, do they have large enterprise architecture departments? And the answer is basically no, right? But that is for a very specific reason, that the two things are already so tightly connected that they don't need a lot of glue. Now that means in some odd sense, right, part of the role of an enterprise architect is to work him or herself out of a job. Right, that sounds, of course, a little bit not so uplifting. The reality of it is, though, in a world that's moving in a large organization, basically your day of retirement will likely arrive before you work yourself out of a job. So it's actually much safer than it sounds. There's plenty of things to do, and let's say you are a good architect who actually managed to work yourself out of a job in one organization, you will have 50 job offers to do this somewhere else, right? So no worries, right, at all. But in the end, right, you're supposed to close the gap and reduce the amount of glue that you actually need Because we'll find out if these two things don't connect, that causes all sorts of problems. So that as preamble, right? Why do we even have this in the first place? What is the purpose about it? Now we can talk about, and I said purpose and value are closely connected, right? Because in an enterprise, the important question is generally, what's the value of doing something, right? Why are we doing something? Generally, because it generates value for the customer, for the business, for somebody, right? If there's no value, then the question is, why are we doing it? So the way I look at enterprise architecture, I see it as a value chain. And that has two important properties. A, the word value is in there, right? So ultimately something for the business comes out of there. And the other thing is a chain has some interesting properties, right? As we see in this simple picture. The chain has the property that each element isn't that complex, right? Each piece of it isn't like rocket science, isn't that difficult to do, because the chain consists out of links, right? The links are relatively simple pieces. But then comes the other property of a value chain, or like any kind of chain, and that is one of the links breaks or is not there, the whole chain falls apart. All right? So each link doesn't seem that important, but if one is not present, the whole thing doesn't work. Right? And that translates from a physical chain into a value chain. Right? And that's, I think, what we should really look at as enterprise architects. And we'll go through these. I'll go through this and illustrate a little bit what I mean behind it. One more comment on the word value. I like the V word, the value word, so much that when I worked in large IT, I sort of played a prank on many people. And that was when they came up with these large presentations, right? Here comes the head of application development, the head of infrastructure, right? Like big, $10 million projects to be funded, right? So in the end, the number of PowerPoint slides has to be in proportion to the amount of money you're going to spend, right? Otherwise, nobody believes you've done your homework, right? So they come with these 50 pages, 70 pages kind of things. So the prank that I used to play is Control F, value, enter, right? Just search in this slide deck whether the word value appears. I mean, come on, if you have 70 slides, right? Odds are, you have space to use the word value. It can't be lack of space. But as you realize, more often than not, the hit rate was not that good, right? You will have these like 70-page things that the IT is going to do and asking for a large amount of money, and there's not the word value in there one time. Now you can be clever and say, okay, maybe they use some clever synonyms about value, but at the end of the day, value is a very simple and very descriptive word. If something provides value, you will probably say this has the following business value or something, right? So I don't think it's a matter of word choice. It's just a matter of sometimes in the IT, this thought of value is missing, right? And I think that's another important part of enterprise architecture to bring this back in, right? If the purpose of the value isn't clear, why are we doing it at all? But with that, right, the value chain of enterprise architecture, let's run through these 8 steps, right, and see what's behind there. And it starts so that the top, and if you wish, it's sort of a successive zoom in. So it starts with a business strategy, right? And these are some examples from the insurance business. So before I worked at an insurance company, I thought insurance is not that particularly interesting. Right? You buy a car, you need insurance, otherwise you can't register. If you have stuff in your house, you buy homeowners insurance, right? Somebody steals your stuff, right? Hopefully the insurance company pays out, yada, yada, yada. The company I worked at, Allianz, global, very diverse insurance company, it is a little bit different. So, what do these 4 pictures have in common, right? They span some history and time here, actually. What have these in common is basically, Allianz paid out, or some predecessor of the corporate structure basically paid out. So whenever something is on TV where it's smoking, sinking, falling apart, burning, whatever, all the sad things that can happen, that is something that hits them as a claim. So that gives you some idea of the scale of some of these things, right? It also gives you an idea if something like this happens, right? The first thing they want from the insurance company is not to get the claim paid out, but they need crisis management, right? They need to get the people off the ship. They need to get people safe. They need to minimize the damage. They need to communicate. They maybe need to protect their brand, right? There's a lot of things they need before they need the money. So you realize that large insurance companies engage in a lot of these things, right? This is not about, okay, here's $50, right? This is a very different way of engaging with your customers, both at the time the claim occurs, right, when something bad happens, but also at the time when you sign the insurance policy. So let's say you have an oil drilling platform, well, good for you, right? And you want to have this insured. So you go to Allianz and say, please insure my oil drilling platform. They say, yes, we can, right? That's a part of their business. It's called corporate specialty. But then, of course, they will come look at your oil drilling platform, Yeah, and they will like turn the whole thing upside down and inside out, and they will tell you all the things they don't like. Because anything that's an extra risk to them, right, they don't want to insure. So they have tons of engineers who do nothing but sort of inspect power stations, oil drilling platforms, who inspect the engineering to make sure they actually understand the risks. Also something that probably most people didn't think about when they think about sort of basic insurance. So long story short, most business, once you look a little bit closer, is actually very interesting. We sometimes think like, oh, all our Docker, Kubernetes, Knative, that's all the cool stuff, right? And the business people, well, they're stuck with, selling insurance policies, right? Too bad for them, right? So we kind of think about this a little bit. Once you look at a business from any angle, it is actually quite interesting. They have regulatory stuff, they operate globally, internationally, taxation issues, liability issues, right? Competitive pressures. There's a reason that the people who run this kind of business tend to be pretty clever folks, right? So that's my pitch. Once you really have a look at a business, you'll find their business is actually really, truly interesting. Now, understanding the business has two parts to it, right? And I have some points here about the divisions, their units, their products, their geographic expansions, right? Where do they make most of the revenue? Where do they make most of the profit? Where do they have most of the growth? Three very different things, right? Understanding how the business runs. But there's another part of it, and that's how are they structured? What are the divisions, right? Are they organized geographically or by product line? Well, in large companies, it's usually both, right? Allianz had some global lines that are then organized by product, but they're also organized by geography, right? And just understanding the organizational structure is also fairly complex and also quite interesting. And you might think like, hey, hold on, I'm an IT architect or enterprise architect. Why do I have to worry about the organizational structures? Because somebody else decides this for me, right? There's going to be a CEO and head of HR and all these other people who do this. But as you'll find out is that by looking at the organizational structure, you can actually understand a lot about how they look at IT. Right? And the way the business looks at IT, if your job is to close the gap between business and IT, understanding how they look at you is something very, very important, right? And if you work inside the IT, like most of you guys ultimately will report to a CIO or maybe a CTO, like a chief information officer. That's usually the person that has all the IT budget and where everybody rolls up into. So you have the inside view of IT, but it's much rarer that you get sort of the outside-in view of IT. And looking at the org chart, you can actually derive an awful lot about when they look at UIT, what they think. When your CIO meets with his or her boss, what kind of discussions do they have? What do the other senior leaders talk about or think about when they talk to your CIO, who might be your boss's 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 boss, right? So one interesting thing is, where does this CIO report into, right? He or she will have a boss, right? Traditionally, many CIOs reported to the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer. What does the Chief Financial Officer do? Well, the Chief Financial Officer writes checks, or rather avoids writing checks, right? They're trying to control the spend, right? So if the IT is situated there, that means it's seen largely as a cost item. Right? The less money we spend on it, the better, right? Make sure everything runs. We don't have anything fall apart. But if it runs, the less money we spend on it, the better. Now, whether you like it or not, if that is the view, the logical consequence is, well, you outsource IT somewhere where it's cheaper. Now, we joked about this a little bit before, right? If it's all a cost, if you can get it for 10% less, well, that's a logically right thing that's what you should do, if cost is really the key metric. Now, the question is that the right attitude? But if this is where you are, of course they will outsource IT. No matter how much you complain about it or say like, oh, we know better, this is not the way to do it, right? If they look at it from a cost perspective, they will do what is logically conclusive. So you can see a lot about where you are there. So who knows here in this organization, who knows whether the CIO reports to a CFO? Do we have examples? It's quite common, actually. I don't want to make it sound like a really bad idea, so don't be shy. Not so much, actually. Interesting, right? Because when we just were down in Perth, we had workshops, and in both companies, this used to be the case. They changed recently, right? But they both used to have exactly this. So when it changes, what happens, it usually changes in this direction, where either then the CIO reports to the COO, the COO is the Chief Operating Officer, and that's a big step forward because it's no longer just about cost, but it's about return on investment. So you can invest some money to get return, right? Suddenly, if something costs, $10 million versus $5 million, if it's a cost model, it's very easy. $5 million always wins. This case, you look at like, oh, maybe the $10 million invest gets me a much bigger return because I can do it properly, so I'm happy to spend more because I get a larger return. The thinking changes fundamentally. The way I explain it, if you own a car and you only look at cost, you will not change the tires or you will not change the oil because it costs money. Right? And you're like, oh, that's not very clever, but if all you're about saving money, you will not change the oil. Car still runs until some point, right? So not changing the oil has a very poor return of investment, but it cuts your cost. So you can see that this is a big step ahead to go purely from the CFO. And it's not like the CFO is not a smart person that says you don't need to change the oil in the car, right? The problem is that the CFO generally doesn't see the return on the investments that you make. And that's why they just look at the cost side, right? Because they don't see what comes out the other end. Right? And that's why this is broken. It's not like the CFO is a bad person, right, and doesn't get this. The CFO has a different point of view, a different universe, different objectives. Right? And that's why this doesn't work. So as you'll find, so the IT, and as the view of IT changes, you'll find a couple more models. The most common ones is you have a chief digital officer, a CDO. Usually the CIO doesn't actually report to that person, but they're often in parallel. And who has a chief digital officer in their organization? Come on, somebody must have, no? Really? You guys are all independents, right? You all work for yourself, so there's no, you are the CIO, CFO, CTO, everything, right? No, this is quite common. I mean, this used to be almost like a fashion. If you're like any sizable organization that has any kind of transformation agenda, you gotta have a chief digital officer because you want to be digital, right? So usually what this means is that these enterprises split their IT between sort of the old traditional IT, and that stays under the CIO, and then they build sort of a new, faster, digital. They might even do continuous delivery if you're really lucky, right? So that's like the CDO. They build a new IT where sort of things move the way the modern world will do it. And they run these side by side. Clever solution has its own set of problems, right? Probably part of a separate talk. And then another stage is, well, the CIO is just like the other top executives. They report straight to the CEO. And the big difference there is that sort of as these reporting lines shift, it also means they expect different things from the business, right? As I said on the far left, they're just like, okay, the less money we spend, the better. Versus if the CIO reports straight to the chairman or to the chief executive officer, it means to them the IT is an integral part of the business and it's just as important as the financial officer or the distribution officer or the VP of sales or all the other people who are in this organization. Like IT is at the same footing, right? So when I was in Perth, in both cases where they had the CIO previously reporting to the chief financial officer, in both cases they now report to the CEO. So almost all organizations will move to the right if they do move. And I've seen many other examples. At Allianz, the CIO was under the COO, which was quite good. They had a separate CDO, so they were somewhere at stage 2, 3. So long story short, right, you feel that, okay, this org chart, all these senior managers, all these vice presidents and chief somethings or others, right, that is not as interesting to me because I'm an IT person. Reality is, oh, this is quite important because it tells you sort of what they expect from the IT. And if you're a senior architect in the IT, that also defines what the expectations for you are. And what you do to provide value should be in line with this because that's the expectations they have. So this purpose value question comes back down to this. Now, of course, understanding the business and the organization and the business's view of IT is only helpful if you can translate that into something, right? Like knowing it is nice, but doesn't provide value. You got to provide value by doing something with it. So the next thing you do is once you understand the business, you also understand the business strategy, and your task is to map that into an IT strategy. And I'll show some concrete examples. Now, a couple of things are important. People use the strategy word quite a lot, right? Dave said I worked in a consulting company, and was whenever time a client project, when sales found a client project that didn't seem very lucrative, either the customer didn't want to pay, or they only wanted one person, or it was all kind of difficult, the answer was always, it's strategic. Right, it's a strategic customer, and then once it was a strategic customer, sort of no questions would be asked, right? So you got to be careful with the strategy word. People use this quite a bit, right? It's like many people use the strategy argument by like making all counter arguments go away because After all, it's strategic. So not quite that easy. So in the end, what you need to realize, right? The strategy is not reality. So what I faced in Allianz, we said, okay, our IT strategy is we have a container-based runtime. We package stuff in the containers, we deploy, we get deployment automation, we get all these kind of things, we get runtime automation, we deploy in containers. That is a key element of our IT strategy. And somebody says, oh, my application does not run in a container. That's okay. It does not invalidate the strategy because the strategy is where you want to go, not where you are today. If strategy is exactly the reality, then it wasn't much of a strategy. So it needs to point somewhere. Second part is, the strategy is also about not doing some things. If it's sort of like, oh, I provide the best product and the best service globally everywhere and the lowest price point, well, that sounds really nice. We call that wishful thinking. It is also not much of a strategy. You need to prioritize some things and deprioritize other things. Otherwise, doing everything and wishing for the best also isn't a strategy. People always say hope is not a strategy either, right? Classic example, right? This is out of my insurance days. We had a very long provisioning time for virtual machines. And as the business reality often is, the simple reason there was because of the contract with the outsourcing provider. Well, happens, right? The contract says it can take N days, and if it can take N days, well, you can be pretty sure it will also take N days, no matter what the technology can do, right? It was just a reality. So part of my strategy was I said, I'm not going to fix that. And that caused a lot of controversy in the organization because we need machines faster, we want to be digital, right? Continuous deploy, auto scale, all this stuff we want, right? How can you say you're not going to fix this awfully long provisioning time for a virtual machine? My answer was quite easy because I said, I have other ways to provision compute power to you. That is not a virtual machine. I can give you a container. I can give you a cloud runtime, right? I can do many other things that you can have in minutes or seconds even. So I'm not going to fix this problem of the slow provisioning because my strategy is I'm going to go over here anyway. And if you don't follow my strategy, it's okay to increase your pain a tiny bit. Right? Because, that makes a motivator. Why should I invest money in something that's not in my strategy? I should rather take that money and make sure my strategy actually works out. Very tough, very unpopular decisions to be made in large enterprises. They always feel like they need to do everything. Oh, the customer asked, I need a pink server that is 45 degrees spanning 4 racks and has 20 terabit connection. We're like, oh, we must do this because the customer said so. And my first question is always, what's the purpose of this thing and what is the value of this thing, right? Why are we even talking about this, right? And IT has this habit of thinking to make the customer happy is doing exactly what the customer asked for. Unfortunately, these are two very different things, right? It's good to listen to the customer and understanding what they asked for, but it's also very good to have a dialogue. And it's like, okay, how did we even get here? Right? Why do you need this thing? Where's the value? Where's the purpose? Right? So saying what you don't do is a critical part of a strategy, but also a very difficult one to have the discipline to do. And then the last one is, large organizations tend to be buy over build. Most of you will buy your IT or large portions of the IT because there's no point in building it all from scratch. What can easily happen then is that you become somewhat dependent on the product roadmaps of those products you buy. And one of the architects in my team, he phrased this very nicely. He asked the network security team, that happens when I talk too long, the network security team, he asked them about where's your roadmap? And they came back and they showed him the Cisco product roadmap, basically, right? Probably Cisco even made it for them, right? They probably went to Cisco. It's like, hey, these architect people, man, they want some roadmap thing. I have no idea. Do you have anything? And they're like, here you go, right? And they're like, oh, thank you. It's like, oh, look, looks good, right? We're going to have application-defined networks, dynamics, software-defined, self-healing, right? It's like fantastic, right? And then the guy from my team, he said, hold on, people, right? Your network security strategy is not Cisco's product roadmap. You need to know where you want to go. And if it so turns out that Cisco product are luckily, magically, fully aligned with that, now that is good, right? But I want to make sure this is a two-step process. And you will find this quite a bit. The vendors are very good at sort of injecting those ideas into it. So Yeah, very important. So making this strategy sounds trivial. It's like, oh yeah, we're going to go to the cloud. It's like a nice strategy, right? It is not quite that easy. You need to really think about, okay, what are you willing to compromise? When you do that, how do you get to this target state? And also make sure you're not like regurgitating whatever the vendor has told you, but that you actually have your own version on why you want to be in the cloud, which way you're going to go, what goes first, how do you measure the value, right? These are things that you need to do for your business, right? This is not something a vendor can do for you, right? You're running the show, so you should make those decisions. I have one example, and it's a bit more complicated. So this is one of the first books on enterprise architecture. Funnily, it's actually not that old. So these days, everybody talks about enterprise architecture. This is like, oh, I forgot when this is published, maybe like 10, 15 years ago at most, right? It's not that old, actually, right? So we often forget that these concepts are relatively new. The book, a lot of stuff, a lot of stories, right? But there's one diagram that is really useful, and luckily that one is available on the web for free, so that's helpful. It has a 2x2 matrix. I always say when you communicate to management, if you're talking about business strategies or upper levels, 2x2 matrix is great because senior executives feel very much at home. They feel like finally these IT people understand me, right? Finally they can frame this in a way that makes sense. So like instantly you score, right? When you bring the 2x2 matrix, bonus points already to be had. In this case, of course, what does the 2x2 matrix have? It has two axes, right? So the one axis here is about how much the business processes are replicated, like they call the standardization, like how much they're identical. And the other one, the vertical one, is how much they're integrated. So quick example, McDonald's, a franchise, right? Or we have Marriott on here, right? A classic franchise business is very much standardized and replicated, right? Each thing they do looks very much the same, but they're not very much integrated, really. They have some financial reporting, maybe some supply chain kind of stuff, but basically what this McDonald's does and what that McDonald's does has very little in common. The vertical axis is different, right? You might run something like oil and gas exploration, which goes all the way from like finding oil to like gas pump, right? Very, very diverse, but highly integrated, right? They all have something in common. So those would be the extreme examples about what it means to be standardized and what it means to be integrated, right? And let's say that's good enough, right? We call this a business operating model. Now your question as chief architect, or the question to you as a chief architect is, please make me an IT architecture that best fits this model, right? And now you need to think a little bit hard. Let's say on the bottom left, let's say this business does a bunch of things, but they neither very much integrated nor replicated from the business perspective. What's the best you can do? You give them some common platform to run all their applications on, and that's pretty much it, right? And cloud does this to a large extent, right? Cloud doesn't sort of assume like the way your business is replicated or something, right? It gives you a common runtime platform, reduces your IT run costs, right? Does many good things, but that's pretty much all you can do. If it is a replication, if it's highly integrated, if it's highly standardized, right? If it's on the bottom right, you can do a lot more. You can make standard applications, right? I guarantee you, McDonald's has a prefabricated, cashier registration, hamburger flipper, French fryer, receipt printer, reorderer kind of application, right? That they just install in every McDonald's. So you can increase your level of standardization because the way the business is done. And interestingly, when I worked at Allianz, one of the biggest discussions I, as the chief architect, had with the board was really around how much standardized versus not standardized the business is. He firmly believed, like the COO firmly believed, we can roll out standard applications and run every business unit on the same application. I was a bit more on the bottom left, or like the top left. I was more on the left side, that I think integration would have a high value, but I didn't think that we can standardize all the applications. Maybe we can standardize some application modules, but in the end, the corporate specialty folks and the investment management folks and the sort of car insurance folks, they run quite different businesses. So this was one of the key discussions to be had, right? What IT strategy matches the business operating model? Because what happens is easy to see, and I warn people, if this is out of whack, all the great software delivery, everything else you do will not fix this. So what can happen is that IT is asked to roll out a standard system across all divisions. Right? It's a good thing to do, reduces complexity, economies of scale, right? All the good things. Well, what happens if you're not in this replication sector? What happens if your business units are, in fact, from a business perspective, very diverse? Those projects are not going to go very well. And you can't fix that with a continuous delivery pipeline or anything else, right? It will not go well because what you build for them from the IT perspective doesn't match what they need from the business perspective. And to make it even worse, it will be considered an IT failure when it's done, right? Because IT wasn't really able to deliver the value with that system rollout. In the end, the reason for that is because you try to fix a business problem with an IT solution and the two did not match. And all the other stuff we talk about will never fix that, right? If that project is below budget and ahead of time and has absolutely no defects, it's still going to fail because you try to solve a problem that is not what the business needs, right? So very careful there. If that is out of whack, you'll never recover. And that's for you as an enterprise, as a chief architect, it's so important to make that work. Just last example is on a vertical axis, right? If they really live from integration, you have techniques like data lakes, data integration, right? You have other stuff, and you will find those to be much more valuable. And McDonald's will not maybe benefit from this as much. Maybe they do some financial reporting, but other businesses will benefit much more from data integration because of the nature the business is, right? And this is sort of high up sort of in this value chain, but as value chains are, it won't work if the rest won't work if there's a big gap up there. Now that you've done this, one thing you need transparency, right? You need to know where you are because you have a strategy where you want to be. And the way this works is you know where you are, you know where you want to be, you have a gap, and you make a plan to solve the gap. So with management also, the 2x2 matrix is good, and a plan is also always good, right? Always show how you get from here to there. Management loves this. So there's a catch with the reality, and the catch with the reality that it largely looks like this. Right? And you say, look, dear business, finally I understand our IT. And they say, okay, nice. Thank you very much. Right? So couple of problems, right? A, getting a picture of reality is already very difficult. And then B, if you actually manage to get it, it is usually not very meaningful. So we come to this a little bit later, how you make some sense out of it. And I can never help myself but make the joke where I say, looking at this architecture, it has one very desirable property. And the desirable property is that this is a hugely scalable, really nice, almost infinitely scalable architecture. And you know why? It's because the database is at the bottom left and nothing is connected to it. It's like, this is the epiphany, this is the pinnacle of statelessness, right? It's just like, they don't even need the database, right? It's just like, there's no connection. Yeah, so fantastic, right? See, architecture is an interesting field. Moving on in our value chain, now that, as I said, IT management or upper management loves a plan, a roadmap. Now the catch there is, you have a reality which is already complex, and then getting from that reality to somewhere else is also complex. So what I learned over many years is that you need to define a roadmap and a target picture that is meaningful but simple. And ironically, that's the most difficult thing to do. Like the convoluted picture in some sense is easier to draw because you just kind of, follow all the pieces. It's easier to draw than to really articulate an IT strategy that is A, meaningful, and B, intuitively comprehensible to many people or many layers in the organization. So here's a real example. And you might say, oh, that's totally obvious. And I would say, well, that's good, because that was the purpose of it. So the idea was, on the left-hand side, what do you have? You have many applications, often purchased, right, buy over build. But you have two problems. They're not very much interconnected, so you have silos. And each of this application comes with its own tool chain, deployment, monitoring, runtime. Sometimes it comes with its own hardware because it comes in a certified hardware stack. The vendors tell you that. So basically means you have complete diversity in your stack. And all this duplication, there's only one person who pays for this, and that's you as the enterprise, because you're the one who's paying, right? So if each of these people say like, oh, look, we built our own version repository, we built our own continuous integration, we built our own configuration. My favorite, we built our own audit framework, so every time you change anything in our software, right, we can audit and trace this back. And it's like, I was like, you ever heard of Git or something? But anyway, so you pay for this every time. So two major problems. Silos you have, and B, huge duplication that you pay for. So you need to get yourself out of it. So what's the key part of the strategy is? You need to build a platform that's a common platform. That can be stuff like you have Cloud Foundry on premise, right? This can be you go to the cloud, perhaps the Google Cloud, right? If you choose wisely, right? You somehow increase the size of your runtime platform. It can be Kubernetes with containers, right? You can have an Elk stack that's containerized that you can nicely auto deploy. That's part of it, right? Or you use cloud-based monitoring tools, right? Like all these kind of things you can do. But what it does, it increases the size of your common platform. And the other thing you do is you start connecting the pieces so you get rid of the silos. Nice, right? But the vendors will say, oh, we don't run on Kubernetes. And then you're going to say, it's like, wow, that's too bad because that is our IT strategy. So either we need to talk to somebody who does, or perhaps we can motivate you to think about, can you make your software containerized, right? That's why I said the vendor product roadmap is not your IT strategy. And then once you do that, you can start thinking about breaking these things down into smaller services. As I said, in Allianz's case, it was very hard to roll out one giant application and make it useful everywhere. But I'm sure things like a rating engine or payment kind of gateway, a lot of things you could reuse very much. So if you make smaller pieces, you can get a lot more reuse. And of course, this is ultimately sort of this whole microservices story minus the micro, right? You don't need to be so micro, but somehow you break things down that you get more reuse, you can get movement, you can get a new rating engine without maybe getting a new claims engine, right? You can start bringing movement into the system. And you can have very intelligent discussions of saying, without a common platform, trying to aim for the picture on the right is actually going to be very difficult, right? If you maintain all this duplication, if you think you're going to build a tool chain from scratch every time you build one of these services, well, the left side is painful, the right side is like plain suicide, right? Doing this times 1,000 is probably the worst idea you can have. So you need to have some standardization, harmonization, get rid of some duplication, that you can break things down into smaller pieces and have more rapid innovation, right? So having these simple diagrams suddenly gets you to talk and think about much more meaningful, much more interesting kind of conversations. And here's a second example, also a real example. In IT, we talk a lot about harmonization, right? Generally, IT has too many things. Like at Allianz, when somebody asks, do you have X? I always say yes. I didn't even have to check because the answer was yes. We had everything. All right, it's just like any product ever. I mean, if you have an IT budget of like several billion euros and the IT vendors are doing their job, the end result, the predictable end result is yes, you will have everything, right? And we certainly did. Now, the problem with that is we had everything largely at the infrastructure platform side, right? You will have, P-series machines, NIX, AIX. You will have Cisco hardware. You will have HP hardware. You will have IBM hardware, right? Or Lenovo, right, these days. You will have anything. Then you have some VCE converged infrastructure. Then you have Linux, all flavors of Red Hat. Then you will have all flavors of something, maybe Ubuntu just for good taste, maybe SUSE if you want to be cute, right, over here, right? Then you have Windows, at least 3 different versions, and the story just goes on and on, right? It's like a museum, right? It's like, it's like, here's the whole encyclopedia of possible IT infrastructure you could have. You name it, we have it. Now, the problem is, does that sell a single insurance policy? Probably not so much, right? That's where the value, that's where the V word come in. The value, the business value of that is extremely small. So what happens, you live on the left side of the pyramid where you have a huge diversity at the bottom of your stack, which provides no value, but often you're lacking the flexibility on the top. The business is always like, can I have this feature? Can I do this? And like, oh, well, it's on the vendor's roadmap. We got to wait till we get the next version, right? And the business is like, come on, people, right? I'm going to make money if I can do this, right? You're like, oh, sorry, can't do, right? So the business feels like they don't get the flexibility to really engage in the business, but at the same time, you have diversity down below where there's little business value. Not a clever setup. So in the end, what you need to do is you need to flip this around. So one thing that we did is to be honest, it took us probably years to come up with these pictures. And he's like, wow, what kind of chief architect you are, right? If that took you like a year. In the end, it took a long time to distill down where is really the biggest problem in the shop, and to make that into a visual where you could refer back to and people would say, yep, you are right. This is our biggest problem and this is what we want to solve with our IT strategy. It probably took a year, easily, right? A good test is also when you have these pictures, don't be too shy about reusing them. It's like advertising works with repeat impressions. So you just show people the same thing. We always feel slightly dirty when we do that, but it's totally fine. It needs a few impressions for this to sift in. And what I also did, I generally gave names to these pictures. Like these were known diagrams. So this is called like flipping the pyramid. Right? Like the pyramid is like this, you want to turn this upside down. So when I said, we got to flip the pyramid, people knew what this meant. And this is part of strategy and branding, right? You explain things in simple terms, you give it a name, and when you say, I'm going to flip, I think, this is a classic case where, we need to flip the pyramid, people understand what that means. And that goes a long, long way. And I said, this takes time. And if you reach this stage, it's like all new inventions, right? They all go from sort of, impossible, you go the denial phase and you end up with obvious, right? This is when it ends up in obvious, but that is the hardest stage to get to. Last two pieces of the value chain are slightly different, but very, very important, right? I said any link missing will not work. Of course, nothing is going to go the way you planned it to go, right? Going through these 6 phases, we're like, oh, this is easy. Gregor said, all I need to do is understand the business strategy, relate the IT strategy, make a roadmap, make some nice picture, give it a good name, kaboom, I'm done. Not going to happen this way, and knowing that it's not going to happen doesn't magically go the pain away, but it prepares you a lot better for what you're up towards, right? It's like you need to plan that, you will find resistance, you will find things that cannot be done. Maybe your great container strategy will be shot down ultimately, and you have to backtrack and start over. Stuff like this can happen, and you need to be prepared for it. So you can't give up easily. You got to know where you want to go. And the second, or the last one of this is, there's a very human aspect to being the chief architect and running an architecture team, and that is, rather than telling everybody what to do, you should focus on getting people to understand what they can do and help them make their own decisions, right? You're not going to be the matrix guy. You're going to be able to bring these ideas through a large organization. You need to teach, mentor, train people, because otherwise you create all your fancy diagrams and all your Kubernetes, native, whatever kind of thing, and if nobody else in your organization can understand what that even is, you're not going to go anywhere. All right? So we, even in our team, we underestimated this a little bit. We did a lot of this within the architecture team, because there's always new stuff, a lot of mentoring, training, very, very nice team setup. But in the beginning, we did not do enough of this outside of the team. And it wasn't like because we didn't care, it's just like because you're busy, right? And if you're running the architecture team, people are kind of wondering, well, are we going to set up another training class, right? Or are we going to kind of drive the IT roadmap? In the end, we found one without the other makes no sense. So we did architecture certification programs, we incubated people, we did many, many things to sort of uplift the IT and architecture understanding throughout the organization. So if you skip this one, all the other stuff will not help you. So now we have the value chain. Right? Now it's important to see what do you need to be able to do to make this successful. Right? It's nice to have an 8-step recipe kind of thing. Right? Now there's a couple of things that you need to have in your head to make this work. And this mainly, I summarize that as 3 things, which is you need to be able to make connections, you need to be able to find abstractions, and you need to be able to make decisions. But before we go there, I want to look a little bit at the value again. Because we said in a business environment, V for value is so important. It's a good question to ask, what's the value of architecture? Right? What's the purpose? Why do we have architecture? Right? And not just enterprise architecture, but architecture overall. So the nicest explanation that I have found, and this was in a conversation actually at Allianz, was that the role of architecture is to provide you options. Right? And options are things, like many of you are from the financial industry, right? Options are things where you can make a decision in the future, but fix the parameters today. Like I can buy the option to buy Allianz stock for 200 euros. Today it's like 180 or something like that, right? I can buy the option that allows me to purchase Allianz stock for 200 euros next year, in 1 year from now, right? So I fix the parameter, but 1 year comes, I can decide whether to buy or not to buy. And in that case, the decision, let's leave taxation aside, the decision is relatively easy. If in 1 year the stock is worth more than 200, of course I'll take my option, I'll buy for 200, I sell for 220, I make instant money. If the stock is 180 in a year, same as today, the option didn't come through, I let it lapse, I don't buy the stock for 200 if I can buy it for 180. Now think about what that means in the IT world. So one of the most thankless tasks in IT is server sizing. Right? It's like somebody wants to roll out a big application, people go to the infrastructure team, how much hardware do I need? Right? So people go at this for like 3-4 weeks, they do all their math and come back, it's like, here's your bill of materials. Right? Sad reality is, Server sizing has only two possible outcomes. Either it's too big or too small. Right? If it's too big, you wasted money, you didn't need that much hardware. If it's too small, the application doesn't perform. We all as architects know the option you can sell as the architect. The option you can sell is, I can make your application horizontally scalable. Right? And with that, I no longer need to make an upfront decision. I can make the decision later at known parameters. I can add more compute as I need it. I can take it away as I need it. You can easily see that this option has value because I don't need to buy all this hardware up front. I don't need to make all this guessing game, right? And this is why these options are valuable, and this is why architecture is valuable. It can sell you these options, and these options have an inherent value. And if you want to be extra clever, it actually turns out that the more volatile your environment is, the higher the value of the option. So let's say you make an application which has 10 users and will always have 10 users. This option of horizontal scaling isn't as valuable. But if you launch something on the internet which is highly volatile, highly unknown, highly uncertain, you might have 100 users today, 100,000 tomorrow, right? This option becomes much more valuable. So the more uncertainty you have, the more valuable the option. If architecture sells the option, that means in an uncertain world you should have more architecture, right? So that's a nice pitch for us as architects because we live in a very uncertain and a highly dynamic world, both from a business as well as from a technical perspective, right? And that's why architecture plays such an important role in a rapidly changing world. All right, really quickly, what do you need to be able to do a good job as an architect? You need to be able to make connections, right? And here's an ugly truth about architecture, and that is no one actually cares about your architecture. Because most people don't even see it. Right? Well, it's like, how can they care about something they don't even know it's there? What they do care about is they care about the properties the system has that your architecture gives them. Like, is it maintainable? Is it scalable? Is it resilient? Right? All these kind of things. Now, you find a couple interesting things, and that is those properties largely hinge on how it's put together. Right? You can see left and right. Do you think those two systems have different properties? Oh, most certainly, right? On the left-hand side, it's very easy to replace something. It's maybe not as resilient because if one component fails, the end-to-end communication falls down, right? Maybe latency is higher. On the right-hand side is almost the exact opposite, right? It's more resilient, but more interdependencies, more coupling, right? Is exactly opposite, yet they have the same components. So architecture is all about connections. I've gone so far as to say if somebody shows me an architecture picture with no lines, I highly question how meaningful that architecture picture is. Because if it all comes from how it's put together, if you don't show me how it's put together, right, I have a hard time seeing this as a useful architecture. Oops. So the way to illustrate this is, right, you can start with nice ingredients. This is like an Oracle database, WebLogic server, right? Kind of, all the nice ingredients that they have, some Cisco routers, right? All that kind of stuff. And based on that, you assume you're going to get this. It's like, oh, yummy, tasty, right? But depending how it's put together, you might get this. Oh, yuck, what the hell is that, right? So in the end, a good restaurant is good ingredients help, but the chef makes the restaurant. And that's the architect, right? It's how it's put together makes all the difference. Yet, when you ask IT people about what is your architecture, you often get answers like, Oracle database, WebLogic server, Cisco router, right? People list the ingredients. People don't list how it's put together. Second one is abstraction, right? So we live in a complex world and unfortunately not getting any simpler, right? So you got to live with the complexity. The best way to battle the complexity is abstraction. And what you do when you need to abstract something, you make a model, right? Most of our architecture drawings are models, right? Now, models have some interesting properties, and that is all models are wrong, because they're not reality, they're an abstraction. And the second one is the abstraction is only useful if it helps you answer a question or make a decision. Like, we shouldn't be drawing architecture pictures because we want to fill the walls with modern art. We should be out to making a decision, right? And that means, if you follow this line of reasoning, that means that the best architecture drawing is clearly defined by what question you're trying to answer, right? Some people say, oh, is this a good architecture? I'm like, well, I don't know because I don't know what you're trying to do. So the second thing is first thing is all models are wrong, but the second one is the model isn't right in any way. It's just fit for purpose or unfit for purpose. And unless you know the clear purpose of the model you're making, you cannot answer that question. Right? So if somebody shows you an architecture picture, two very good questions to ask. And the first one, are there any lines? Right? And the second one is, what question you're trying to answer, what decision are you trying to make. And only once that is clear, it's the purpose, right? Only once that's clear, you can say, yes, this is a useful architecture picture, right? And maps are the best example. 4 maps shows the same thing, basically our planet, very different questions, right? Top left is probably, what's the easiest way to hike from A to B? Or, where does it flood if the river rises, right? Can answer those questions. Bottom left one is, what's the best route to drive from Atlanta to Birmingham? Very different questions, very different maps, right? You can also see on the bottom left, I guarantee you the highways are not painted orange. The last time in Germany, bottom right, it was also not all red, right? Models are not reality. Like Germany wasn't red and France wasn't orange the last time I checked, right? It is not the point for the model to be reality. It is the point to answer the question. Yeah, in the bottom right case, where do I build my distribution centers? Well, perfect. Yeah, the map can answer that. It shows the population density. So remember, it's all how it's put together, right? The lines are important, and it's all about what question you're trying to answer or what decision you're trying to make. Well, and you have tools to help you do this, right? So obviously you have enterprise architecture tools. They can be very helpful. The key advice I give there, always make sure that the tool works for you and not the other way around. Very easy to happen. I've seen whole enterprise architecture teams that work for their tool basically, instead of the other way around. Make the tool work for you. And then the tools can be very valuable. But you gotta ask that question. Last one, one more. You're working with complex systems, right? So as you do this architecture, as you find these lines, you will find that making changes to what you see often leads to unanticipated results. So this is the classic cobra example. So I got to tell that really quickly. So India in the old days, cobras are there. Cobras are not very nice animals. In Singapore, we used to have tigers, all that kind of stuff, very similar. So what do people do? They put a reward out for the cobra. They say, if you bring me a dead cobra, you get a rupee. Well, sounds like a really good idea. What happens? People start breeding cobras because it's a new source of income, right? I was like, well, that wasn't exactly what I wanted. So you say, okay, never mind, right? I'm not going to pay for all these cobras, right? I stop paying for the cobras. What happens? People release all the cobras they bred because they no longer have any value, right? Seems like, okay, that's not very clever, but you find this in IT all the time, right? People's calendars are too full and it's hard to schedule a meeting. What do people do? Put the blockers in the calendar just in case. Well, what did you just accomplish? You just made the calendars fuller and it's even harder to find a meeting spot, right? There's examples to no end. So if you want to really understand the model should help you think about the behavior of the system so you don't fall into this kind of trap. Excuse me. Last one is decisions, right? As I said, main purpose of the model is to help you make decisions. So you should go and make the decisions. Oops, let me skip here. This is more interesting. The way decisions should work is that you should have a strategy, right, which tells you the general direction you goes into. Based on the strategy, you have some principles that you follow, and based on these principles, you make decisions. And that ensures that the decisions have some consistency, right? There's a common driver, which again, in this eight-piece chain, was the first part, right? The second important part about decisions is that decisions that have no downsides are rarely meaningful decisions, right? If sort of going route A, everything is better, and going route B, everything is worse, probably you kind of didn't pick a very meaningful thing to decide. Happens a lot in IT, actually, unfortunately. So a good decision, right, and I like the quote from George Fairbanks is, right, because we value X, we decided Y, and we're willing to accept downside Z. Right? We are willing to accept the downside. And I add and I said, well, doing something to minimize the downside is also a smart thing to do, but you're accepting a downside because you follow a certain strategy. Those are good decisions. If your decision doesn't allow you to make that kind of sentence, you probably made some trivial decisions, just like, oh, we're going to have a database. Yeah, well, really nice, right? What would be the alternative, right? So you probably didn't decide anything, but you said, oh, I use a document database because, unstructured data for us is valuable, yada, yada, and I take into account that I have a soft schema and maybe it's a bit more complex to work with. Well, that starts to sound like a much more meaningful decision because you know where you want to go and you are willing to take some other things into consideration because you know there's pros and cons. So wrapping this up, right, as you do this, one of the key things is in the enterprise, it's vast and it's fuzzy. So you need to divide and conquer. So some people say like, oh, once I have transparency across my whole enterprise, I can do a fantastic job as enterprise architect. The problem is that day will never come. Right? So you need to divide and conquer. You need to pick pieces where you can start making this value chain, where you can make this cycle function, and you generally need to use this in a smaller part of the organization, because you try to boil the ocean, that will just never happen. So with that, right, enterprise architecture is an interesting animal. Like, none of the pieces I talked about are like black magic. Right? It's like make a strategy, business strategy, IT strategy, roadmap, make some decisions, use models, right? Find the connections, right? None of this is like really that complicated, right? A lot of it is common sense. Things need to have a purpose, things need to provide value, right? The catch is that doing this at the scale of an enterprise, it is so easy to get lost in the complexity in all the different products, the versions, right? The global scale, it's so easy to get lost that the biggest problem is that the enterprise architects don't see the forest for the trees, right? Because there's so much stuff. And the second one is they become enamored with their tools and they end up working for the tool instead of the tool working for them, providing value for the business. So in the end, it's not like enterprise architecture is somehow magically very difficult. It's just so easy to get off track, right? And that is the biggest danger. So it takes a lot of discipline to kind of keep the important questions in mind. And with that, I want to conclude, and that is really, hopefully reestablish some of the belief and the value of enterprise architecture. Done right, it's highly valuable. And a lot of it is about having different viewpoints, right? You can only conquer the complexity if you look at things from different angles. And as Dave alluded at the very beginning, I've actually done this throughout my career. I've worked in consulting, I started a small company, I worked in corporate IT, I work at Google, we are building internet scale solutions. So actually having different viewpoints in your career, I found in the end extremely valuable, because you sort of see the different sides of a problem, and that is actually a great way to cut through the complexity. And once you're able to do that, probably the most uplifting takeaway for anybody who's doing enterprise architecture is people who can cut through complexity, who can understand a business, who can find a strategy, who can find a matching IT strategy, who can articulate and deliver the value that's associated with that, those people are in extremely high demand, right? It's like, it's your picking, right? Any organization is going to be looking for folks who can make that chain, who can make the linkage in that chain work. So in the end, I find that very interesting, right? This is honestly fun and interesting to do, but it's also highly, highly valued as a skill set. You will never have enough people who can do that. So hopefully, right, as I said, I gave you a bit of a fresh perspective on what enterprise architecture is. Hopefully also some motivation to go make that linkage of the value chain. If you sort of like the ideas I have and the kind of things I presented, as Dave said, there's a book to it called 37 Things One Architect Knows, right? At least they have one data point. And then Monday, we also have an all-day workshop that talks around IT transformation and the role architecture plays in an IT transformation. So if you like to do that, I think there's still time to sign up, and we'll have a whole day workshop on Monday. With that, I would say time is up. Thank you very much. I'll stick around also for the afternoon. So I think I'll just take questions like during the breaks and a little bit later. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gregor. Cameron, you want to just go ahead and get set up?
Right, and I'll take questions later during the break. Just find me.